warmongering U.S. Senator John McCain, perhaps the most aggressive neocon globalist in the Senate, complained in Europe last week that what he called the New World Order was under enormous strain. The widely ridiculed Republican in name only, or Reno as critics refer to him, also defended key globalist institutions such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the European Union, EU, both of which are under growing pressure from outraged citizens demanding a return of national sovereignty and self-government. Critics were quick to ridicule McCain and some of his Kremlin-centered conspiracy theories, but the globalist establishment fawned over his comments. With the New World Order under enormous strain amid what he described as the titanic struggle with forces of radicalism, American and European globalists can't stand by and lament, "We've got to be involved," McCain was quoted as saying by the online EU Observer. In other words, those who oppose his vision of globalism and big government are radical. Meanwhile, those who support his extremist vision of never-ending unconstitutional war, the erosion of national sovereignty, and an end run around the U.S. Constitution's limits on government are the moderates. At least that is what the failed GOP presidential contender wants people to believe. Speaking at the Brussels Forum organized by the globalist German Marshall Fund, established with taxpayer money to promote globalism, McCain also promoted the long-term internationalist objective of deeper integration between the United States and the EU. The world cries out for American and European leadership via the EU and NATO, a UN subsidiary, McCain claimed. Unsurprisingly, both of those institutions are run by unaccountable and unelected globalists who share McCain's fanatical devotion to the New World Order agenda, transnational governance and globalism. "I trust the EU," McCain continued, calling for more cooperation and more connectivity between the EU and the US government. He also said the alliance between the US government and the EU, which is facing a massive uprising and enjoys virtually no popular support according to polls, was one of the most important alliances. In a nod to one of the frequent criticisms aimed at the EU, McCain conceded that it had too many bureaucrats. However, he claimed there was not much bureaucracy, and that the EU was not the only place on Earth with that problem. Of course, in the real world, European voters across the bloc are scrambling to ditch the bloated and totalitarian EU after the historic Brexit vote showed it was possible for a nation to restore its sovereignty. McCain touched on that, saying he was still wondering what the overall effect of Brexit will be. But, he claimed, it was not yet clear whether Brexit is the beginning of a serious problem for the EU. In other words, it remains to be seen whether the globalist outfit, which got started after World War II and was built on a foundation of US taxpayer money and blatant lies to the public, will be able to successfully suppress the growing grassroots revolt against globalism. In between attacking President Donald Trump for his anti-globalist stance, McCain also touted NATO as a key institution. Promoting the EU and NATO as the best two sums in history, he did call on European governments to spend more money on NATO. The globalist military alliance increasingly has become the UN's enforcement arm, as witnessed under Obama when NATO was illegally sent by the UN to destroy Libya and overthrow its government, leaving the country in shambles with terrorists running wild. We need to rely on NATO and have a NATO that adjusts to new challenges, McCain continued, without elaborating on what sort of challenges he thought NATO would be needed to combat. Trump previously called it obsolete, and has made no secret of his hostility to the EU. Finally, the increasingly erratic senator from Arizona pushed bizarre conspiracy theories suggesting that opposition to globalism and his extreme warmongering was coming from the Kremlin. He said, for example, that he was concerned about the Russian role in our elections, despite admitting he had seen no evidence that they succeeded in affecting the 2016 US election. He also claimed Russia was hoping to conquer various Eastern European countries. And, he said, the Kremlin was trying to influence European elections, including in France and Germany, in favor of anti-globalist parties. It's an act of destruction that is certainly more lethal than dropping some bombs, McCain claimed. Without a trace of irony or a mention of the EU superstate's brazen efforts to quash nationhood and self-government using fraud and trickery, McCain claimed Russian influence in European elections would be a death warrant for democracy. Ironically, when then Czech President Václav Klaus warned in 2012 that the EU was already in the final stages of destroying democracy, McCain was nowhere to be found. Instead, he was busy posing for photos with brutal jihadists, demanding more unconstitutional wars, and seeking more US support for terrorist organizations across the Middle East. Of course, the latest outburst is hardly the first time McCain has alluded to the New World Order using that term. In late 2016, for instance, he warned that the world order was at risk of unraveling. And in confirmation hearings earlier this year for Trump's Defense Secretary James "Mad Dog" Mattis, a Bilderberg attendee, McCain said the NWO was under more strain than it's ever been, and asked if the nominee supported the New World Order. Mattis agreed that the World Order scheme was under attack from Russia, from terrorist groups, and with what China is doing in the South China Sea. However, despite his comments, more than a few prominent globalists including the recently deceased David Rockefeller and Rothschild protégé George Soros have argued that the brutal communist dictatorship enslaving mainland China will in fact play a key role in the New World Order. In fact, Soros even said the ruthless mass-murdering regime should own the New World Order in the same way that the United States owned the Old World Order. Beijing enthusiastically agreed, using its propaganda organs to promote its starring role in what it, too, called the New World Order. Rockefeller, meanwhile, said in the New York Times that the social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history. It also left some 60 million people dead. In the 1990s, then-President George H.W. Bush explained the New World Order in more detail than most others. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations, said Bush in a televised speech from the Oval Office, suggesting that the UN would be a sort of world government with the ability to make law. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders. The UN's key founders, of course, included mass-murdering dictator Joseph Stalin on the Soviet side, and convicted Soviet spy Alger Hiss, who chaired the UN's founding conference, from the United States. The notion of using the UN's peace troops to enforce their totalitarian vision should also be highly alarming. In fact, for generations, the UN's ruthless peace forces have been notable primarily for the systematic rape of women and children in nations they occupy. In one town in the Ivory Coast, a survey by Save the Children revealed that 8 out of 10 underage girls admitted to being raped and sexually exploited by UN forces. Others who have used the term New World Order to tout their globalist system include former President Bill Clinton, former Vice President Joe Biden, billionaire George Soros, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, disgraced former President Richard Nixon, General Colin Powell, retired, mass-murdering Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, South African Communist Party leader Nelson Mandela, the mass-murdering dictatorship ruling Communist China, and countless more. Other prominent globalists have used similar terms such as New International Order and variations on that theme. Ironically, pro-NWO activist McCain, who in 2008 came under fire for violating the law to accept Rothschild money for his campaign, is a big fan of globalist fanatic Henry Kissinger, another key New World Order plotter widely viewed as a war criminal. Kissinger, of course, has been described as an old friend of Putin by Putin's own spokesman, and he regularly meets and dines with the Russian strongman. In his recent book entitled World Order, Kissinger described the path to a new world order very much along the lines of McCain's own scheming, and Putin's. Basically, regional governments combining eventually into a global regime. The contemporary quest for world order will require a coherent strategy to establish a concept of order within the various regions and to relate these regional orders to one another, explains Kissinger in his book. In other words, the world's nations must be brought under the control of globalist regional governments, and then those regional regimes must be brought together like puzzle pieces. Already in place are the African Union, the Union of South American States, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the EU, NATO, and many other such schemes. And despite the lack of media attention, Putin is in fact following the script, building his own regional government to ensnare Eurasia, known as the Eurasian Economic Union, that he hopes to merge with the EU and other blocs. The voters of Arizona should work to remove McCain from office at the earliest possible opportunity. By his own admission, he is working to impose a globalist and unconstitutional new world order on humanity, when his oath of office requires him to uphold and defend the U.S. Constitution. The two visions are entirely incompatible. More than a few critics have even accused McCain of treason for, among other crimes, literally supporting jihadist terrorists and pushing a globalist new world order that is fundamentally at odds with the U.S. Constitution he swore an oath to uphold. Trump was right to attack globalism and promote Americanism on the campaign trail. McCain and every other globalist politician seeking a new world order at the expense of U.S. liberties, sovereignty, and prosperity should be run out of office and potentially investigated. After all, nothing in the Constitution authorizes politicians to surrender Americans' God-given rights and self-government to any outside entity. McCain's vigorous public defense of globalism and the New World Order should be the final nail in the coffin of his dangerous